Brandon Showalter, appreciate you joining me. There is big news when it comes to the Federal Trade Commission, at least according to a report from the Daily Wire. This surrounds the transgender issue. Tell us what the story is here, why this is making such a splash.
It's making such a splash because it's movement on an issue of great consequence. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, a federal agency that's, about consumer protection and policing unjust trade practices, has decided to, in July, study and likely move against the transgender industry, particularly the marketing and practice of so-called gender-affirming care on minor children. And it's very likely that they will then classify the administration of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and the performing of body disfiguring surgeries on minors as a kind of unfair or unjust trade. It's within its regulatory purview to do something like that because of the deceptive practices and marketing and false promises and fraudulent means of presenting this to patients and their families that they are taking this action. So they're going to study the issue, some workshops, panels in July to basically to address this head on from their perch as a federal agency. And all of this is in keeping with, I would say, President Trump's January 28th executive order decrying so-called gender-affirming care as a stain on our nation's history, and it must end, rightly calling this sterilization and mutilation of children. And so the FTC, as are other agencies throughout the federal government, are tackling this head on. Recently, the Health and Human Services Department issued a 400-page report basically showing what we all know to be true, that there is no evidence for transing kids chemically or surgically, but this is the FTC taking the lead now and addressing it from its regulatory powers.
And as far as I understand, the FTC, when they hold a day-long workshop like this, they're generally doing that before they make a case to go after an industry, correct? So that's sort of the assumption here, that because they're holding this day-long workshop, in light of the way they generally do things, that means that what will come next is what you just described, going after this particular industry.
That's right. And from what I have heard from my sources, they indicate to me that the experts that they have lined up to invite can testify to the massive fraud that's inherent in this industry. And when you begin with the fraudulent premise that it's possible for some children to be born in the wrong body, any medical treatment is going to be irretrievably flawed from the start, because it is impossible to be born in the wrong body. And so any chemical puberty blocker or cross-sex hormone given for an illegitimate medical purpose is rightly called fraud. So there's many kinds of fraud. There's ideological fraud, of course, because of the premise that I've just described, but there's also miscategorization of Medicaid billing. There's fraudulent practices that happen within that. I've heard of stories from whistleblowers, some of whom are likely to be invited to this FTC event, that can testify to the fact that doctors who are administering these treatments are fraudulently putting on medical records such things as estrogen deficiency or endocrine disorder unspecified, when in fact these young people do not have those conditions, but they are using those fraudulent diagnoses to be able to prescribe these medications for an illicit purpose. And so the fraud abounds in this space. And so I think it's unquestionably a good thing for the Federal Trade Commission to be addressing it in the manner that they are. And you're right that when they do put on these panels, it usually precedes, what follows after is some decisive action on their part, where the commissioners will take a vote of some kind.
Okay, so you have had a podcast for a long time now, Generation Indoctrination, and through that podcast and the work that you've done beyond that as well, you have addressed this issue probably more than anybody else in the media has, looking at every facet of it. To dig a little bit deeper here, when we talk about claims of fraudulent behavior, claims of manipulating people, into parents in particular, into thinking that this is the only way to save their children's lives, can you talk about some of the shocking things you have seen that make you fully believe what you just said is true, that the FTC should enact its jurisdiction in this area?
I think the worst lie, and I've said this many times, is that parents are told by clinicians wearing their white robes, their doctors with the degrees on the wall, that if you do not allow your children to go down this medical pathway, they are very likely to or will commit suicide. So the emotional blackmail that takes place in a medical setting where you would hope that you'd get some sound advice is all based on a lie. That's a fraudulent claim. There is no evidence to support the claim that a child will die by suicide unless you block their natural puberty with untested hormonal agents that have never been approved by the FDA for that use, or that they will have to cut their body parts off or take cross-sex hormones that will render them sterile. And so the lies just permeate this entire industry, and parents are left desperate, thinking that they may have their custody removed if they don't go along with it. We're hearing stories of that happening, especially in certain states. And so I'm sure, and I know that while I have covered the issue extensively, both in our documentary podcast and in print, I know that I've only begun to scratch the surface, given how many layers of lies and deceit and fraudulent activity that government agencies have been participating in, and especially the medical industries, the hospitals and the clinics, Planned Parenthood. This is embedded so deep within so many of our public health institutions and within really all of the major hospitals. They are completely, to use an analogy, just drunk on the gender Kool-Aid. This is in high places. This has been top-down social engineering. Kids are indoctrinated in school systems to believe that these things are true about their bodies when nothing could be further from the truth. So the fraud abounds, and I do salute the FTC for taking a look at this, because it's, in my opinion, long overdue.
So final question for you. As you look ahead to this July workshop, this full day, what if you could give a recommendation right now to the FTC, what would you want to see them do in the end after that event?
I think so-called gender-affirming care needs to be classified as a fraudulent practice, as an unjust trade. I think as much weight as they can use to dismantle the industry in its entirety, they should do it. I think it needs to be fully exposed that these crimes against children and humanity need to be seen for what they are. And I think as much power as they can possibly use against it and show this to be the immense fraud that we have all known it to be, they should do it. So take every possible step that they can, and encourage their colleagues throughout the government to also take a look and use whatever appropriate measures they can to address this head on, because it is, I believe, Billy, one of the worst medical scandals that the world has ever seen. And we need a full reckoning and accounting for everything that's been done because of these fraudulent practices and all of these lies.
Okay, Brandon Showalter, where can people go to see your work and to hear your podcast?
You can hear our podcast, and we're currently working on another season, which will be out later this year. GenerationIndoctrination.com is our landing page. Of course, it is also available on all other major podcast platforms like Spotify. And at ChristianPost.com, my colleagues and I continue to report what's happening in print. So check us out, ChristianPost.com.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Billy.